Okay. All right, we're talking today with Dr. Moshe Szyf. He's a geneticist and molecular biologist at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And he has done some very interesting research that might expand the notion of Jewish guilt. Well, I guess we'd have to know, first of all, what is Jewish guilt? I don't know if a geneticist can do much more than Webster's, but what do you mean by Jewish guilt, Dr. Szyf? What is Jewish guilt to begin with?
I really don't know what Jewish guilt is, because as a researcher, I'm not interested in Jewish guilt, but I'm interested in understanding basic biological processes. But there's a long Jewish history, and the big question is, how does this history impact us physiologically? How does it impact our health, and how does it impact the way our brains are working? So the question is whether when things are done to people, are the consequences just for one generation, or are they leaving marks behind that can pass on to other generations? Jews were exposed to a lot of abuse for the last 2,000 years. And the question is, do we carry those memories of this abuse in our genomes, in our genes?
You're saying that this is not just something of intellectual recall and memory. You're saying that it could actually be embedded within our chromosomes that would affect our physical and psychological behavior today, so that a child, a young man or a young woman today might be exhibiting some signs of behavior that very well are genetic because of experiences that previous generations might have had?
Right. So we have to differentiate here between genetic and epigenetic. Genetic means that there was a change in a sequence, right? So the gene has changed, and now the offspring has a different gene than the one that was common in his ancestors, and that gene gives him a certain behavior. So that's possible as well, because the Jews in Europe went through a tremendous selection. Remaining Jewish in Europe was tough. And it stands to reason that the guys that are our ancestors were selected for, certain traits that allow them to survive the persecution that they were enduring. That's one thing. But the other thing that I think is more interesting, and more interesting from a Jewish point of view, is that the experiences that we experience can result in a different chemical marking of our genes. And these will define how the genes work, even though they don't change the genetic sequence, but they change the way the gene is marked. And by changing the way the gene is marked, you change the way the gene works. And we have shown that that process is extremely important. And different experiences in life can do that, and can then fashion the way the animal or the human is operating. And so it might well be that the traumas that we suffered in the past left behind those marks that are passed from generation to generation, and they will affect the way our brain works, as well as our health.
What does this all have to do with, let's say, something which does affect everybody, particularly younger members of the community? Let's say between 18 and 26 or 36, people that are forming their values and modes of behavior. What about the concept of, let's say, freedom and responsibility? I mean, you had said, Dr. Szyf, that with a deterministic genome, we can't decide what kinds of mutations we're going to pass on, but if we experience something that's important in building a healthy genome, it gives us a feeling of some level of control.
Exactly.
What does that mean exactly?
Right? And so deterministic genome gives us actually a sense of freedom. And it's interesting that the idea of a deterministic genome came about by Darwin theories of evolution and eventually genetic theories that essentially said that, it doesn't make a difference what we do. If you have the right gene, you'll be smart, you'll be successful. And if you have a bad gene, you're doomed. And that gave you a sense of freedom because you don't care what you're doing and nothing will change anyways. But what we're learning today is that that's not completely true. Yes, there is this element. Some of us unfortunately inherited mutations that will cause disease, like breast cancer and others. But most of the genome is very responsive to the kind of life we're living. And that will define not only our own genome, but the kind of genomes that we're going to pass to future generations. So the way we treat our children, the way we take care of them, it doesn't just have the immediate effects that we see, but they will have long-term effects that will affect their life many years down the line and probably affect, generations in the future. So that adds a tremendous amount of responsibility for individuals as well as for societies. Because we know now how critical the early life is for the developing child, both his health as well as his mental health, intellectual capacity, his moral values, etc. At the basic biological level, not just what we see and feel around. And so therefore, societies have a tremendous responsibility to make sure that the early life is done in a way that will ensure the survival and the success of the child. We even people with genes that, let's say, define them as not as intellectually successful as others, with good enrichment can become as successful as those that have other genes that make them intellectually more fast and fast learners.
Would that in turn then make an imprint on the genes that, let's say, that this young person now going into the avenue of marriage would now pass on to future generations? In other words, what's the gap between the behavioral change of something which has already been imprinted and now reprinting the genome, as it were, if I have the idea right? In other words, somebody you said doesn't have in his genes that great intellectual capacity, but the person decides, I really want to be a good student, I want to make it. And they do become a great student and very successful in what they're doing. Now, how long does it take for that to become implanted in part of the chromosomes that they're going to pass on to their next generations?
Right. So there are two ways by which epigenetic information is passed, and it's important to emphasize that. One way is not through the germline, not through our sperm or eggs, but actually through our behaviors, because we pass behaviors too to the future generations, right? So the behavior of the mother can affect the way the genes are marked in her children, and these children will become mothers, and their behavior will now affect the way their genes are marked in their children. So you can pass for generations, and we know that from animal studies, certain behaviors that without having to have a real germline, what we call germline transmission. So the parents are affecting the children by their behavior in a way that will change the way the genome works. These children will now have their children, and they will do the same thing. And they can pass from generation to generation these what we call phenotypes, so the way that people behave and look. And this is very important from the Jewish point of view because, the whole concept of conversion is really an epigenetic concept, right? It doesn't make a difference what genome you brought into the conversion. Once you become Jewish, your behavior that you adopt will now have an epigenetic transformation, and you become part of the Jewish people, and you pass that to the next generation through epigenetic ways. Of course, there is also another epigenetic way of transferring or transmitting information, which is through the germline, through the gametes or sperm or eggs, and that's much more questionable. But there's more and more data suggesting that not only we pass those epigenetic marks through experience, we also can pass it through our germ cells. And most of the information comes from animals, where there is evidence that experiences could affect the way grandchildren or grandchildren and grandchildren behave. We don't know in humans, what's the balance between epigenetic information that we transmit through our behavior versus epigenetic information that we transmit through our behavior and changes the germline of our children and then is passed from generation to generation through the germline. Most of the evidence suggests that events like trauma, aggression, can be passed from generation to generation, at least in animals, through the germline. Other things can only pass through the behavior of the mother or father. But once the behavior stops, the transmission stops.
What about this idea, Dr. Szyf, of tinkering with the environment? Biogenetics is very well known for that. How does that affect the concept of the epigenetics? as
I mean,
well,
this is the most important thing.
like
in
diet,
epigenetics is the relationship to the environment. Mm-hmm. The idea that the environment can have dramatic effects on the way our genes are programmed and have long-term effect, not just immediate, long-term effects. So even if we are exposed to an environment for, a year, that might have an effect throughout your life and into the lives of your children and grandchildren.
Genetically
and
as well?
Course,
genetically as well?
What's that?
Within a year, that could
I don't
affect...
know if it's a year. I'm just giving this an example. It could be shorter. It could be longer. The idea of epigenetics is that it essentially takes a transient environmental exposure and fixes it, right? So, for example, when we did experiments on the pups of rats that were either licked by their mothers or not, this is only 1 week that the mother takes care of the pups, but it will define their entire life. So even though they're now old, they still behave differently because of the 1 week of licking and grooming by their mother. It's similar, if you have a stressful environment at very short times early in life, they can have a huge impact. So we don't know if it's a 1 minute or 1 year exposure, but we know that short exposures can have long-term effects because the genome remembers our exposures. So an exposure like to 9/11 can have effects that probably will go to future generations as well, even though it was, less than a day.
Dr. Szyf, I know your area of expertise, as we're obviously discovering, is genetics and epigenetics, but in the realm of where you are in terms of your Jewish observance, have you ever run across a chazal that in some way substantiates or corroborates any of the research that you've been doing?
No, I think the whole concept of epigenetics is very strong in the concept of defining parenthood or relationship to the Jewish people. For example, issues of the mother defining the Jewishness of the child is very strongly supported by the epigenetic role of the mother in passing many important traits to the children. And another question is, what's the difference between a surrogate mother or a real mother in passing Jewishness, right? So, we have now in vitro fertilization and we have surrogate mothers. So let's say, a Jewish egg was found in a non-Jewish mother or vice versa, a non-Jewish egg in a Jewish mother. What is more important, right? And this is exactly the question, what is more important, the genetics, because it was a Jewish egg, so it had Jewish genes, or its epigenetic environment, which is being harbored by a Jewish mother. And so, but I think Chazal were very sensitive to the idea that it's not just the sperm, or the genes, but it is much more than that defines Jewishness. And so I think that's absolutely a sensitivity to epigenetics. But also, I think the strong emphasis on what we call Tinokot Shel Beit Rabban, or the early childhood, as a critical time. Another interesting example is, there is a mitzvah of Hakel, which is to gather the people to Israel, to Jerusalem, and read the Torah to them, or Mishneh Torah. And there's the idea that you have to bring the children. And the question is, why do you have to bring the children? They're not going to learn anything anyways. And so that was a profound understanding of how important it is to imprint on children, this kind of moral and religious teachings, even though they don't really understand it, but that experience will be with them for their whole long life and the children's life. So I think, these concepts were very strong, the concepts that epigenetics plays a very important role. I can give you another example. There's a Gemara in Yoma where after Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol comes out of the Kodesh HaKodashim and the whole people are following him, and then Shammai comes out. And all the people leave the Kohen Gadol and go to Shammai, and the Kohen Gadol is upset. He says, I'm the grandchild of Aaron HaKohen. How can you leave me for this one who is a grandchild of Ovdei Avodah Zarah, because he was a son of Geirim? And so what the Kohen is essentially claiming, my genes are much better than his genes, and therefore you should have followed me. And then the story ends with Shammai says, I prefer somebody who is a descendant of a non-Jew who behaves like Aaron HaKohen than a descendant of Aaron HaKohen who behaves like somebody else. And so the idea is that as much as genes are important, like a Cohen is defined by the genetic lineage, there is the epigenetics, which is as important or more important.
We know that as members of Klal Yisrael, we've always tended to live lives, and as evidenced by who we are today, and even the nations of the world, the Goyim understand this and use it as a way of actually admiration, that education, family structure, and religious values. Mm-hmm. So really it should come as no surprise that the values have been passed on. Right. Do you see that as something as still inherent in the genes of Jewish men and women today, that those values are entrenched firmly in our genetic system?
I think they're entrenched in our epigenetic system, not in our genetic system.
What's the difference again between genetics and epigenetics?
So the genetics is the sequence, right? That's past. That we can't change. This we inherited, and many Jews carry genes that come from different kinds of people. But I think what we did with Jewish education and Jewish lifestyle and Jewish community work is create an epigenetic environment that, notwithstanding where our genes came from, whether we carry European genes or Middle Eastern genes or other kind of genes, they all came into this community family workshop that essentially epigenetically transformed them to the Jewish epigenetic environment, and that's the fundamental difference. The epigenetics is dependent on what we are doing. The genetics is dependent on whatever we inherited, whatever randomly happened in the history of our genes. And the important thing about epigenetics, it is reversible. So, if you stop doing these things, that will disappear. So there's no guarantee that, we will, if we don't do what we have been doing, that we will keep the same kind of characters. The characters are a function of continuous repetition of that behavior. Once the behavior changes and we move to a different kind of behavior, we can erase those epigenetic marks and come up with new ones.
So I guess you could say kind of that if a person decides to dress in a very coveted, honorable way, that will lend them to a certain type of behavior, or if they would have dressed in jeans, if you pardon the pun, the genes might very well become part of their...
That's taking it far, but dress is part of behavior, right? And it definitely has an impact. I don't know how strong the impact is relative to other behaviors, but it definitely is part of the whole behavioral milieu that we have.
And that milieu which you talk about, and I'd like to the milieu which we define as environment, is something which, in essence, you're really saying at the very core of this is the environment in which a person is, in which they live, in which they study, can very much impact who they are and who their generations are going to be.
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, this sums up the whole idea of gene-environment interaction.
All right. Dr. Szyf, anything else that you'd like to leave us with, or to our younger generation readers, what would you advise them in terms of, just like you give nutrients to your body, what type of nutrients should they be feeding their epigenetic genes, so that
take a strong emphasis on the children. The earlier, the better. I think the values that we transmit to our children are critical in their well-being, both mentally as well as physically. And as community, again, we have to emphasize those things. Any small adversity that we do will have consequences. And the good things that we do will have consequences as well. And that requires us to be very careful about both our personal behavior and our behavior as in family and as a community. The stronger the communities we build, these values will be passed on and will fashion the health of our children. Not just the mental health, but also the physical health. The physical health is extremely dependent on the family structure, on the completeness of the family, on the love that the family has, on the reduction of adversity in the family, on avoiding aggression. All these things have consequences to both our psychological as well as our physical health. And they put a tremendous amount of responsibility, although we don't understand really what exactly will give us, better health or better mental health. But we know that, if we build environments that are peaceful, that are loving, that are caring, and that they are avoiding, adversity and aggression, the lesson that we'll learn both from biology, from other animals, and from humans is it probably will be much better than the other way. And that gives us a tremendous amount of responsibility.
Dr. Moshe Szyf from McGill University, I want to thank you very much for helping us to understand our responsibility in perpetuating the values of authentic Judaism, both in generations past, present, and future.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Szyf, I just ended the interview. I want to thank you. I thought it was gewaltig. I'm looking forward to hearing from you again. And I think what you're doing is just murderdik, and I love the way that you tied in the other stuff. There's also, I think, a Gemara, Abai and Rabba, right? Or was it Abai's mother, Rabba's mother used to take him into the base medrash?
Yes.
Who was it? You remember?
I don't remember, but I know what you're talking about. Yes. I think Rabbi Yochanan as well, his mother, used to take him behind the Beit Midrash, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan became Rabbi Yochanan. I think the Gemara talks about Rabbi Yochanan, but maybe about Rava as well.
Okay.
And when she was pregnant, she would go behind that Midrash just to hear. That's classic epigenetics.
Okay, that's fantastic. I'm looking forward to speaking to you again, and I hope to get up to Montreal and meet you. Are you there for the summer, or are you coming to Lakewood at all?
I don't come to Lakewood. I come a lot to Teaneck because my children live there, and so.
Great. When you're in Teaneck, please let me know, because I'm in Lakewood and would love to come up and see and maybe do a video interview as well. I think it would have great.
Totally. I come quite often to Teaneck. To visit my grandchildren, so it's a good incentive.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, you should have a lot of Yiddish anakas from all of them.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Koltiv.